the days before ticking clocks and glowing screens, time whispered itself through the world in gentler ways. No second hand danced across a numbered face, no bell rang the hour. Instead, the earth turned and the sun obeyed. Shadows fell long across the soil, and the farmer, silent, weathered, patient, read them like scripture. Imagine it. A small field on the edge of a hill. The year is 1327. The rooster crows not on cue, but as it always has, just before the light. A man stands in his field, watching the shadow of his barn stretch toward the fence. It touches the eastern post. He nods. That means it's time to feed the animals. This was the ancient clock, and it was never broken, for it was made not by hands, but by heavens. Long before sundials took their formal shape, shadows told secrets to those who knew how to listen. The earliest farmers, the ones who scratched their living from the mud in Mesopotamia or along the banks of the Nile, understood the sun not as a distant star, but as a daily presence. Its rise and fall shaped the rhythm of their days, and its shadow, cast upon a familiar tree or hut or stone, became a quiet metronome for the duties of survival. A stick in the ground, that's all it took. The ancients called it a gnomon, though many would have never used that word. A pole, upright in the soil, left to stand. Each day, the shadow it cast would arc across the ground, and each day the farmer would note its path, not with ink or papyrus, but with memory. In the morning, the shadow was long and pointing west. By noon, it shrank to almost nothing, drawing close to the base. In the afternoon, it stretched again, but now eastward. It was like the breath of the sun, in and out, every day, a little different. By these shadows, farmers planned when to water the fields, when to break for bread, when to harvest grain before the heat made the stalks too brittle. They could not count minutes, but they could feel them. Some say it was instinct. Others say it was training, passed down from father to son, mother to daughter. But the truth may be stranger still, for it wasn't he, the farmer, who learned to read the shadow. It was the shadow that taught the farmer. As civilization grew, so too did the sophistication of shadow time. In ancient Egypt, great obelisks were raised tall and proud, not only for the gods, but for the sun. Their shadows moved across carefully placed stones in the sand, markers of time for a nation that lived by the flood of the Nile. The Egyptians, masters of precision and ritual, divided the day into sections, not hours as we know them, but parts of light and dark. Still, the farmer in the delta would glance at the temple's shadow and know it was time to turn the soil. In Babylonia, astronomer priests charted the heavens, but it was the lowly farmer who watched the shadow of the ziggurat crawl across the courtyard stones and understood when to release the goats or gather figs. Even in far-off China, before mechanical clocks arrived from the west, shadows were measured by instruments of stone and bronze. The ancient Chinese gui bao, the shadow board, allowed farmers to gauge not just the hour, but the season. For in the slow drift of shadows, not just hours, but months revealed themselves. This knowledge was sacred and practical, mysterious and mundane. It tied the farmer to the cosmos in ways we have forgotten. The shadow on a stone wall was not just an indicator of noon, it was a sign from the sky, a silent message from the eternal dance between sun and earth, telling the farmer when to sow and when to reap, when to rest and when to rise. And yet, this sacred skill was never written down in books for the common farmer. It was learned by watching, waiting, feeling. A child might be asked to watch how the shadow moved during morning chores. He might not understand why, not yet, but in time, he would come to know that when the shadow reached the edge of the well, it meant it was time to walk to the next village. That when it touched the apple tree, mother would be done baking the bread. In this way, time was not exact, but it was enough. Modern clocks gave us precision, but perhaps they stole something too. They tore the farmer from the earth's rhythm and strapped him to an artificial beat. But long ago, when the shadow ruled the field, there was harmony. The earth turned. The sun moved. The farmer watched. And in the silent stretching of a shadow, he heard the voice of time itself. Before the world was divided into hours and minutes, before time was numbered, it was felt. Not in seconds, but in shadows. In the countryside, far from temples, far from cities, The earliest farmers told time beneath the limbs of trees. Each morning, the farmer rose before the sun broke the horizon. It was not habit, it was necessity. The dew still clung to the grass, and the sky hung heavy with promise. The morning light, slow and golden, crept across the land, and the shadows, oh, the shadows, stretched endlessly like fingers reaching for something just out of sight. Under the same tree he had stood by the day before, and the day before that, the farmer looked at the earth. There, beside the gnarled roots of an old fig or olive, the shadow reached across a rock. When it passed a certain stone, he knew the goats would be rising. When it reached the edge of the well, the chickens would be scratching. It wasn't science, not then. It was memory, observation, a private, unwritten calendar kept in the folds of the land. Sometimes the trees themselves became timekeepers. Old oaks, standing alone in the center of a field, cast predictable shadows that told the farmer everything he needed to know, not just about the hour, but about the season. For as the days grew longer or shorter, the shadow fell in different places. A good farmer, a patient farmer, could watch where the shadow touched on certain days and know that the solstice was near. In this way, a tree was not just shelter from the sun. It was a companion, a witness to toil and growth. And the shadow beneath it was as constant as breath, changing always, yet forever returning. Children, too, were taught to watch the tree's shadow. When they were young, they would sit in the dirt, watching ants crawl over the roots, but slowly they would come to notice the light, how it shifted from morning to noon, how the branches danced upon the ground in silent time. A mother might say, "When the shade touches the river stone, come home." No one had a sundial. No one needed one. In some parts of medieval Europe, village councils would meet only when the church's bell tower cast a shadow that touched the town square. But in the countryside, where churches were far and bells seldom heard, the shadow of a tree was enough to mark the gathering hour. In the absence of bells, the bark stood tall. Of course, the weather changed things. Clouds could hide the sun. Rain could erase the shadows altogether, but that only deepened the farmer's bond with the sky. They did not expect perfection. They expected patterns, and even those could be broken. In that way, time was a living thing, not bound to the rules of machines, but to the moods of nature. In the ancient world, particularly in places like Greece and Rome, educated men built sundials of bronze and marble, but those were for public squares, for philosophers and politicians. The farmer's sundial was simpler, a tree, a rock, and the knowledge of where the shadow should fall. In Roman Britain, archaeologists have found farms with stones arranged in circles, not for worship, but perhaps for measuring the passage of sunlight. Not every stone circle was a temple. Some were just calendars etched in shadow. Time was not a sacred thing then, or rather, it was sacred because it was useful. The shadow beneath the tree could also tell of danger. When war came or raiders prowled the hills, the farmer needed to be gone by the time the shadow reached the hedge. Travel was safest at certain times of day when the sun was behind or just above. Too early and the roads were dark. Too late and the forest filled with strangers. The shadow was safety, a silent signal to move or stay. In every generation, some farmers became known for their uncanny sense of time. Old Marek, they would say, never misses a meal, never wastes a moment. But Marek had no clock, only his tree, only his quiet knowledge of the shadow's shape across the field. It's easy to forget this kind of time, slow, deliberate, tied to the land. Today, we chase hours on our phones, check minutes on our screens, measure sleep in digits. But there was once a time when the day's rhythm was soft, warm, and dappled beneath the branches. In Japan, the practice of measuring time by shadow reached such refinement that a farmer could walk among his rice fields and know, by the faint shape of a bamboo stalk's shadow, whether it was time to begin planting or to wait another day. The narrow stalks, the slanted sun, the ripples of light between leaves, it was all part of the same silent system. No alarms, no numbers, just light and dark. A language as old as time itself. The farmer, standing beneath his tree, with his eyes half closed, watching the ground, was not idle. He was listening. Listening to the sun speak. In that moment, time was not something to fight against. It was something to walk with, a companion, a teacher. And the shadow beneath the tree, long, soft, shifting with the hour, was the clock face of the ancient world. Every field has its secrets, and sometimes those secrets are carved in stone. Picture a farmer's barn, rough-hewn, thatched, leaning slightly from age and wind. Beside it, nestled into the earth, lies a flat stone. At first glance, it's just another rock. But upon closer inspection, it tells a story, one etched not in words, but in scratches, little lines, tiny grooves. A few too straight, too purposeful, to be natural. This is no ordinary stone. It is a marker of shadows. In many parts of medieval Europe, before clocks found their way to farms, before bells called the hours to prayer, a stone like this, laid beside a barn or a stable, or the family's water trough, served as the farmer's timepiece. It was not sophisticated, not like the brass sundials of the city or the obelisks of ancient Egypt, but it worked. And it lasted. Over the course of years, sometimes decades, a farmer might note where the barn's shadow fell at different times of day. When it touched the edge of the stone, it was time to turn the soil. When it crossed the furthest mark, the cows were to be herded back from pasture. The groove near the center? That marked midday, though the farmer would never have used that word. This was not an invention. It was an evolution. The markings were not carved in a single afternoon, but accumulated gradually, deliberately. A father might scratch a line and explain it to his son. When the shadow S here, you start the flax harvest. That son, in time, might add another. When it reaches this spot, mother's bread will be ready. A quiet family tradition, etched in stone and never spoken of as anything extraordinary. And yet, these stones were the farmer's almanac, not filled with weather predictions or planting tables, but with something more personal, memory, fixed into the ground. In rural Wales, some of these stones survive. Not famous, not catalogued, but known to the locals, always beside barns, always marked, a stone, a shadow, a reminder. One old tale tells of a shepherd who never missed a shearing day, not because he had a calendar, but because his father had scratched a line on a stone when the sun reached a certain angle. That was enough. That was everything. Elsewhere, in the dry regions of the Pyrenees, farmers would use the corner of a stone wall to cast a shadow across a slate slab on the ground. As the sun arced through the sky, the shadow slid across the slab. And on that slab, scratches, some almost invisible, but each one remembered. Each one part of the daily rhythm of toil. This knowledge wasn't always taught. Sometimes it was simply learned by standing still. The farmer would rise, step outside, and wait. Wait until the barn's shadow kissed the mark near the water barrel. Then he'd whistle, and the dogs would come running. The chores would begin, not because a clock had struck, but because the sun had whispered through its shadow. Now. Even as mechanical clocks appeared in cities, they were slow to reach the countryside, expensive, fragile, misunderstood. But the sun was free, the barn stood tall, the stone lay steady, and that was enough. Some of these shadow markers even tracked the seasons. The angle of the sun in December is not the same as in June. The farmer knew this. He'd watch, day by day, as the noon shadow lengthened in winter and shrank in summer. He didn't need to know the mathematics. He could feel it in his bones and see it on the stone. Sometimes the markings were almost ceremonial. In Eastern Europe, a barn might be built so that its longest wall faced precisely east. The shadow it cast at dawn would fall directly onto a row of stones, each one representing a different phase of farm labor. Plowing, planting, weeding, harvest. It was not an exact science, but it was exact enough. And when storms came, when clouds hid the sun and the shadows disappeared, the farmer waited. Time paused, tasks were delayed. There was no panic, only patience. The stone would wait, the barn would cast its shadow again. In this way, time remained tied to place, to a specific barn, a specific field, a specific family. The grooves on the stone were not universal, they were personal. One farmer's feeding hour might be another's time for prayer. In Japan, farmers use similar techniques with upright stones, known as ishibodai, carefully arranged to cast shadows onto lines drawn in the soil. These lines, traced and retraced through generations, helped peasants know when to transplant rice, when to let the paddies dry. A quiet system of order in an otherwise chaotic world. So, too in Scandinavia, where winter days were short and precious. There, a wooden pole, stuck in the frozen ground, might be used to track the sun's return in spring. The first time the shadow reached the old hearthstone again, the family would know. The cold was breaking. Life was beginning once more. But it always came back to the farmer and his marked stone. A simple object, heavy, unmoving, but full of meaning. 1,000 glances had passed over it. 100 years of footsteps had walked beside it. Rain had worn it, moss had crept across its surface, but the marks remained. Because the shadow always returned. And the farmer, whoever he was, whatever age he lived in, would stand once more in the quiet of the morning and see, by the shape of a shadow on stone, that it was time to begin. No bells, no ticking hands, no glowing screens. And yet the farmer knew when it was noon. Not by glancing at a device, but by feeling it in the light, in the land, in the silence that settled over everything. Noon was not just a time. It was a stillness, a shift, a brief pause in the daily labor where even the animals seemed to slow, and the sun overhead cast no shadow long enough to follow. It was in this moment, when the shadow shrank into itself, drawing close to the base of every object, that the farmer could say, without uncertainty, "It is midday." Across civilizations, this instant was known, felt, measured not in minutes, but in the angle of light. In ancient Egypt, obelisks stood tall in temple courtyards. At noon, their shadows aligned with special stones placed at the base. It was not for ceremony, it was for knowing, for understanding. When the shadow nearly vanished, it marked a turning point, the beginning of descent, the start of the day's second half. And the farmer, whether on the banks of the Nile or in the hills of Tuscany, felt that shift deep in his bones. In many rural villages, farmers took their break, not because a horn was blown or a bell rung, but because the shadows had retreated. The stick leaned against the fence, which cast a long shadow at dawn, now seemed to stand alone, its dark twin curled close. The wall that once threw a stripe across the garden now barely shaded a stone. The children, watching quietly, learned this too. "When the shade hides," their mother would say, "it is time to eat." This was the sun's sigh, the exhale at the midpoint of its journey. In parts of India, farmers working the paddy fields used a simple tool, a pole fixed in the earth. Around it, in a rough circle, they drew lines in the mud, recording where the shadow landed each hour. At noon, the shadow would fall upon a single, narrow space. When it did, the farmer would lay down his sickle, wipe his brow, and sit beneath the nearest tree. There was no rush. No urgency, just trust in the light. The Greeks called this moment mesembria, the middle of the day. The Romans, merides. From these words came our modern meridian, the great invisible line across the sky that the sun crosses each noon. But the farmer did not need these names. He only needed to see the way the sunlight changed, how it flattened, how it seemed to press down upon the land. In Scandinavia, where the sun hovered low for most of the year, the noon hour was still sacred. Even when shadows were long, there was a moment, a quiet, narrow moment, when the sun was highest, and the light came in through the slats of the barn roof in a perfect angle. Farmers would stop their work when that light reached a certain crack in the wooden floor, a sign as good as any clock. In China's vast countryside, rice growers used bamboo poles in the fields, not for crops, but as markers of time. The midday shadow, always the shortest, told them when to return from the far paddies, when to boil water for tea, when to let the oxen rest. Their grandfathers had done the same, so would their sons. The moment was universal, yet unspoken. Even in the New World, among the Inca of the Andes, shadow watching was a part of agriculture. Tall stones called sayanas were placed carefully on the terraces. At noon, their shadows vanished or aligned perfectly with grooves in the ground. The highland farmers knew it was the time of highest light. The sun was listening. And so, around the world, the farmer met the sky halfway. At noon, work did not end, but it paused. A quiet meal, a shared glance, a brief stretch in the sun. The shadow would soon lengthen again, but for now it was at its shortest. Time itself seemed to hold its breath. In some places, farmers built tiny shelters called shade huts, nothing more than a few sticks and thatch, but they were placed not at random, always where the shadow lay at noon during the height of summer, a cool refuge, a place to rest, a recognition that the sun, like the farmer, had reached its peak. Children learned to find noon by watching their own shadows. In the morning, it stretched in front of them. In the afternoon, it chased behind. But at noon, they stood still and turned slowly, marveling that their shadow had shrunk to a pool around their feet. They laughed, of course, but in that laughter was knowledge, the oldest kind. And in those few precious minutes, the farmer stood still too. His shadow, once long and wandering, now short and centered, like a compass needle at rest. This was not about science. It was not about astronomy. It was about rhythm. The rhythm of the earth, the sun, the day, and the farmer, dusty, weathered, eyes squinting against the light, stood in the center of it all, guided not by hands on a dial, but by the light above and the soft, patient shadow at his feet.
The farmer's shadow was not the same in July as it was in January. And he knew it. He didn't need a calendar to tell him the solstice was near. He didn't need parchment to mark the equinox. All he had to do was stand in his field, watch the light bend, and observe how the shadows changed their path, day by day, season by season, because time for the farmer was more than the turning of hours. It was the turning of the earth. In the earliest days of agriculture, this understanding became survival. When to plant, when to harvest, when to rest. All of it depended on the long dance between the sun and the shadow. At midsummer, when the sun was highest in the sky, shadows grew short. At midwinter, when the sun barely crept above the horizon, shadows stretched across entire field. The farmer, patient as always, took note of these changes. He may not have known the word solstice, but he knew its arrival by the shape of his shadow on the frozen ground. In Neolithic Britain, great stone monuments like Stonehenge were built not just for ceremony, but for sunlight. The stones were arranged to align with the solstice. On those days, the sun's shadow would fall exactly between two slabs or across a carved groove. Some say they were built by priests, but others believe they were for the people, especially the farmers. A grand sundial for a nation that lived and died by the seasons. Thousands of miles away, in ancient Mesoamerica, the Maya built pyramids whose steps caught the shadow of the sun in astonishing ways. During the spring and autumn equinoxes, the shadow of the feathered serpent god, Kukulkan, appears to slither down the pyramid's side. It is a spectacle of light and stone. But more than that, it is a marker of planting time. A signal that the rains will come. Farmers in those regions, without any clocks, use these moments to guide their work. The play of shadow on sacred steps was as important as rainfall. Even in simpler villages, the same principles apply. In a quiet alpine valley, a farmer noticed that, at the height of summer, the midday shadow of his barn barely reached the path. But in autumn, it stretched across the entire yard. He began cutting hay when the shadow finally touched the base of the old apple tree, just as his grandfather had done. In Eastern Europe, farmers carved notches on fence posts to mark where the noon shadow landed at different times of year. By the time it touched the third notch, it was time to repair their fields for winter rye. If the shadow passed the fourth notch, they were a latte. Timir was not vague. It was exact enough. And in the hot plains of North Africa, Berber farmers placed stones in long rows beside their home, each corresponding to a solstice or equinox. These stones didn't move, but the sun did. And when the morning shadow pointed toward a certain rock, they knew it was time to begin the date harvest. In this way, the shadow became more than a marker of hours. It became a calendar, soft-edged and shifting, but reliable nonetheless. Children were taught this early, not in school, but through repetition. "Look where the shade falls," the mother would say. "Do you see it? It's longer now. That means the coals is coming." In time, the child would grow into a farmer himself, and he too would watch the shadows, speaking little, measuring the year not in months, but in lengths of dark. In medieval monasteries, monks noticed the same changes. Though they had bells and timekeepers, even they recorded the shifting shadows on the cloister floor. In the scriptorium, one monk wrote, "The shadow at Sext is longer now. Michaelmas must be near." It was not superstition. It was observation. The slow learning of those who lived close to the earth. Far from the cities, where time was kept in towers, the farmer measured the year by light alone. A stone beside the gate, a tree at the edge of the field, a fence post, a plow handle. All became silent sundials when the sun was right. In Japan, seasonal farming required acute awareness of solar shift. The farmer's hut would have a small window, not for air, but for sunlight. When the morning beam entered at just the right angle, it struck a bamboo rod on the opposite wall. That moment meant it was time to sow barley. No words, no dates, just shadow. Even in the Arctic Circle, where the sun vanished for weeks, its return was sacred. The first shadow cast after the long dark was a sign of hope. Hunters watched the angle. Mothers whispered blessings. And a farmer, scratching a living from the frost, stood outside and let the light fall across his boots. It was time to begin again. And so, across the world and across centuries, farmers follow not just the sun, but the shape it left behind. They saw in the shadow a story, not of darkness, but of guidance, of change, of quiet instruction from the sky. Because the sun never speaks, it only shines, and the earth in turn draws its answer in shadow.
A stick in the ground, nothing more, no gears, no chimes, no magic. Yet for thousands of years, this simple object guided farmers more surely than any clock. It was called a Gnomon. Though the farmer might never use that name, he simply called it the post, or the marker, or sometimes nothing at all. It stood in his garden or in his field or near the well, and every day it told him something new. The Gnomon, always upright, always silent, cast a shadow, and that shadow moved. Not randomly, not quickly, but with quiet purpose, tracing the sky's slow arc from dawn until dusk. At sunrise, the shadow was long and westward. By noon, it shrank, and in the afternoon it stretched again, this time to the east. But more than telling the hour, it told the rhythm, the pattern, the shape of the day. Farmers in ancient Babylon used gnomons to chart the stars as well as the sun. But on the farm, the gnomon's purpose was simpler. to say when it was time to start and when it was time to stop. A gnomon might be made of anything, a wooden staff, a carved stone, a tall reed. What mattered was that it was straight and fixed. The farmer would observe it day after day, season after season. Over time, he would come to know exactly where the shadow pointed when the goats needed feeding, or when the flax was due for harvest, or when the last potatoes should be pulled from the soil before the frost. In Greece, long before mechanical clocks, every farmer had some form of gnomon. The philosopher Anaximander, who lived more than 2,500 years ago, is credited with formalizing the gnomon as an instrument. But he merely described what farmers had already known for centuries. The sun moves, the shadow follows, and time lives in the space between. In ancient China, the gnomon was part of imperial astronomy, but also part of village life. In the countryside, farmers would mark lines in the dirt around the post. Over time, these lines formed a sun map, a circular diagram of changing shadows. When the tip of the shadow touched a certain line, the farmer would begin planting rice. Another line meant the rainy season was coming, and another that it was time to build up the granary walls. It was accurate in a way that needed no numbers. In rural India, gnomons were used with flower beds, a tall stalk surrounded by marigolds. Each morning the shadow passed through the blossoms, and when it touched the far petal, it was time to stop watering. Grandmothers would teach this to the youngest children long before they could read or write. When the shadow kisses the gold, they would say, "Your chores are done." And in the Americas, before European arrival, the native peoples of the Andes used upright stones, natural gnomons, to tell not only the time of day, but the shift in seasons. One stone's shadow, when it aligned with a distant peak at dawn, meant it was time to begin planting maize. Not superstition. Precision drawn in shadow, the gnomon did not need attention. It did not demand, it did not buzz or blink, it simply stood. And those who watched it, truly watched it, learned to see what others missed. In medieval Europe, farmers often placed a gnomon near the chapel, where the shadow at Sunday's high sun would stretch to touch the corner of the altar. This was how they kept the rhythm of worship of rest. The church bell might chime, but the shadow had already said it was time. Sometimes the gnomon was a family tradition, a pole that had stood for generations. Children would be told stories about how their great-grandfather had planted it, and how its shadow had guided the very first planting of wheat in the family plot. A simple stick, but sacred in its purpose. And when clouds came, the farmer did not curse the gnomon for silence. He simply waited. Tomorrow, the sun would return, and with it the long familiar shape on the ground, reliable, returning, true. The gnomon also reminded the farmer of the larger pattern, that the day moved slowly, that there was no need to rush, that every task had its moment, and that moment would come as surely as the sun would rise. In Japan, gnomons were sometimes placed in small courtyard gardens, not for farming, but for daily rituals, tea brewing, meditation, the feeding of birds, all of it marked not by alarm, but by the quiet arc of a shadow on gravel. The same principle, the same peace. Even today, in scattered places, old gnomons remain, forgotten, often covered in moss or leaning slightly with age. But still there, still casting a shadow, still whispering the old rhythms to any who might stop and look. Because the gnomon is not really a tool. It is a relationship between the earth and the sky, between the farmer and the day, between silence and knowing. And all it asks is that we slow down, that we watch, that we remember how time used to feel when it was traced not by machines, but by the sun. There is a moment in the late afternoon when the day begins to lean. The light grows softer, the air stills, and the farmer, without glancing at the sky, knows the long shadow has returned. It is not evening yet, not quite, but the sun has begun its descent, and the shadow, stretched tall and slow, follows behind everything that stands, a fence post, a water jug, a child walking back from the stream. All of them now trail a dark echo along the earth. This is the hour of the long shadow, and for the farmer, it is one of the most important times of the day. Across the centuries, farmers used this hour to end one kind of work and begin another. The heavy labor, the digging, the harvesting, the hauling began to slow. But lighter work, gathering, feeding, mending, often began here, in the golden edge of day. Not because someone told them to, but because the shadow said so. In ancient Mesopotamia, farmers knew this hour by the way their own silhouette doubled their height. A man might look down and see a shadow taller than the house. That was the sign to gather tools, to call in the animals, to prepare the final tasks before dusk. In old Japan, there was a phrase used in farming villages, kage no biru toki, when the shadow stretches. This wasn't just a poetic saying, it was an instruction. It meant that the tea water should be put on the fire, that the goats should be brought home, that the grain sacks should be covered for dew. In every corner of the earth, the long shadow was a signal that the day was preparing to end, but it was not sudden. The transition was gentle, like the slow unwinding of a song. In rural France, farmers would often say, "When your shadow touches the gate, the hens will be waiting." A quiet reminder that time was not something watched, it was something felt. The hour of the long shadow could also mean safety. In the highlands of Peru, shepherds kept their flocks near water. But when the long shadows began to fall over the distant slopes, they would gather the animals close. Not because night had come, but because it would soon, and predators often waited for twilight. In India, the moment of the long shadow marked the beginning of preparation, not for night, but for evening's work. The oil lamps would be filled, the cooking would begin. In some villages, the women would begin to sing, not to the sun, but to the returning dark, a soft lullaby of labor. And still, the farmer watched the ground. The tools in the field cast their own shadows. A hoe, left standing upright, would show the hour by the angle of its length. The rake's handle became a dial. Even a pile of hay could tell the time, if one knew how it lay in the light. Children learned to chase their shadows during this hour, laughing as the length grew. But in the laughter they learned that time moved, that the light shifted, that there was a rhythm to the day, not on a clock but on the earth. In ancient Greece, philosophers watched this hour from courtyards. But the farmers, quiet, sun-worn, unnoticed, understood it best. They didn't name it. They didn't record it, but they obeyed it. In northern Europe, the hour of the long shadow was sometimes used to measure the distance of work. If a man's shadow reached the barn, it meant he had been in the field long enough. If it touched the hedge, it was time to turn back. Simple, yes, but effective. And tied to the world in a way that modern timekeeping never is. And in the Islamic world, the long shadow played a part in daily prayer. Not in the cities where clocks hung in mosques, but in the countryside where farmers knelt beside their fields. The afternoon prayer, ASR, was traditionally performed when an object's shadow was equal to its height, and it was the farmer, not the scholar, who could spot that moment without doubt. In every part of the world, the long shadow was an equalizer, a reminder that time, for all its mystery, still followed rules written in light. It told the farmer, the day is not over, but it is changing. It whispered, finish what you can. Carry what must be carried, leave the rest. And as the sun drifted lower, the farmer, eyes narrowed, hands resting on a shovel's worn handle, knew the day's end was near, but not yet here. There was still time, still warmth, still work to be done, but all of it under the eye of the shadow, now long and lean, stretching softly into the coming dusk. There is a moment in every day when the shadow vanishes. Not forever, not completely, but for a brief time, when the sun stands directly overhead, the shadow curls beneath the object that casts it. It hides, it withdraws. It becomes something smaller than the thing that made it. And to the farmer, this disappearance meant everything. Long before clocks told us it was noon, long before the concept of 12 o'clock existed, there was simply this, the time when the sun was highest and shadows fled. A time known by sight, by habit, by generations of quiet watching. In the highlands of East Africa, where the sun passes directly overhead twice a year, farmers would gather in the center of the village to witness the shadowless moment. A pole, placed upright in the dirt, would cast no visible shadow. The earth felt still. The people would pause, not to worship, but to observe. For this was nature's balance, a brief symmetry between sky and land. Even in places where the sun never quite reached the zenith, Farmers still noticed the point of smallest shadow. They called it different names. In ancient Persia, it was the sun's crown. In parts of the Indian subcontinent, it was Madhyahana, the middle of the day. In China, it was called Zhongwu, the noon peak. But always, it meant one thing, the turning point. The farmer did not mark it on a chart. He did not measure its exactness in numbers. But he knew it. He felt it. The heat would rise. The insects would still. The dogs would lie down. And the tools, those made of wood or metal or bone, would stand almost motionless in their narrow pools of shadow. Nothing long, nothing stretched. Just a small circle, tight and firm at the base. In Central America, the Maya used this moment to begin certain rituals. Their great cities, with pyramids that sliced the sky, were built to align with the sun's highest point. But it was not just ceremony, it was agricultural. Corn was sown with respect to these moments. Time was kept by what was not seen, by the absence of shadow. To the farmer, the disappearance of shadow was a signal. It told him, the day is half spent. The morning's work is done. The second half lies ahead, but it also gave a gift, a pause. In parts of southern Europe, midday was not just a time. It was a space between effort and effort. The Spanish called it la siesta, but even in places without that name, the concept lived. The farmer would sit beneath a tree, watching the leaves tremble in the heat. He would chew bread slowly, drink water with both hands. He would not rush, for the sun, even the sun, was pausing. In North Africa, Berber farmers observed that at high noon, the shadows inside their tents nearly vanished. The light filtered down in columns. Their woven mats were illuminated without contrast. It was a sacred light, not religious, but pure. It needed no interpretation, it simply was. Children, too, learned the sign. In village schools with no clocks, they knew the break time had come when their shadows grew small. Look down, the teacher would say. The sun is beneath you now. Rest. The farmer's world was not driven by urgency. It was driven by cues. And none was clearer than the vanishing of the shadow. Even in the Andes, where terraced fields clung to mountainsides, the Quechua-speaking farmers had names for the moment when the shadow shrank to nothing. They used it to time their alpaca shearing, a practice bound not to date but to light. And in medieval Europe, the monastic bells might toll the canonical hour of sext, the 6th hour of daylight, but for the farmer beyond the abbey walls, the only bell needed was the sun itself, casting its thinnest lines. This disappearance of shadow was not mysterious. It was expected, trusted, but it was never taken for granted. Because time, when it becomes visible, demands attention, and when it hides, it invites reflection. The farmer, leaning against a tree, would glance at the base of a pole, see that its shadow had drawn inward, and understand, this is the middle, the apex, the turning of the wheel. It was not something to be rushed past. It was something to be noticed, and in that noticing, time slowed, the work slowed. Even the heart, perhaps, slowed. For just a few moments, there was no chasing, no marking, no measuring, only light and stillness, and the quiet knowledge that the earth had turned halfway through its daily path and would soon begin its return. Before clocks were built from gears and bells, before the ticking of time could be heard indoors, there was another timekeeper, older, simpler, silent, the earth itself. And the farmer, humble and sun-worn, turned the soil into a sundial. It needed no engraving, no marble, no ornate arm, just a stick or a shovel, or a standing stalk of wheat planted upright. Wait for the sun to move. Watch the shadow drift. In this way, the field itself became a clock, not with numbers but with movement, not with hands but with shadows. In ancient Babylon, farmers placed tall rods called gnomons at the edges of their barley fields. These were not sacred or decorative. They were practical. A gnomon at sunrise threw a long shadow toward the west. By mid-morning, the shadow bent. By midday, it vanished beneath. By afternoon, it pointed east. It marked time not in minutes, but in purpose, sow, water, harvest, rest. Even in Bronze Age Britain, where the sky was often cloaked in mist, the appearance of shadow was precious. Farmers there arranged stones in rings, not only for seasonal solstices, but also for the daily dance of sun and shadow. A single upright stone, placed with care, could tell a farmer when to begin the long walk home. In India, the practice was passed from parent to child. A sharp bamboo stake pushed into the garden became the family sun clock. The children would check it. When the shadow points to the mango tree, the mother might say, "Come in for rice." Time, marked not by hours, but by trees. There were no alarms, no chimes. Only the sun, the stick, the shadow. In Rome, even as the empire rose and engineers built precise sundials in marble, the countryside clung to its own method. Farmers in Latium, the plain beyond the city, often relied on nothing more than a pitchfork set upright in the soil. "Watch its finger," they'd say. "It will tell you what to do." They didn't need Latin inscriptions to know the time. They needed to see the shadow touch the edge of a path or cross a row of olives. That was enough. In Japan, the shadow of the farmer's own hoe became a signal. Leaned against a fence post, it marked the moment between planting and watering. Its length, its direction, these were lessons passed silently from one growing season to the next. A sundial does not demand precision to be useful, it tells you enough. And that was all the farmer needed. In rural Africa, farmers carved shallow ditches in the dirt around their huts, aligned with the morning and afternoon shadows of a central pole. Over the months, they would notice which shadow touched which groove at which time. No numbers were etched. No hourglass turned. Yet meals were prepared, livestock were fed, seeds were cast into the right furrows. The sundial in the soil was not a monument. It was a memory. In ancient China, farmers sometimes laid flat boards in their fields with a stick at the center. They called it a gui bao, a measuring plate, but most had no such devices. Instead, they watched how the well's pole darkened the stones at certain times. The well's shadow became the farm's heartbeat. The soil and the sun were partners. The earth received. The sun revealed. The farmer stood between them, observing, remembering, adjusting. He did not need to write anything down. His field told the time. His tools told the story. A bent plow casting a thin line on the dirt meant it was nearly time to turn the rows. A tall broom left leaning meant the animals would soon wander in. Each object, if left upright, became a dial. In Central Asia, nomadic herders did not plant sundials. But when their yurts were pitched for more than a day, they drive a wooden peg into the dust and mark the line of its shadow with stones. Each day the sun would draw that shadow differently. And with each shift, the herder knew the wind is changing, the time for moving is near. No wristwatch could compete with that. To the farmer, the sundial in the soil was more than a tool. It was a contract, a quiet agreement between land and sky. It said, "I will follow you if you show me the way." It said, "I do not need to own time, I only need to walk with it." The shadow moved, the farmer moved, and together they measured the world. No ticking, no counting, only light cast across earth. There is a day each year when the sun climbs highest. The ancients called it the solstice, not for science, not for calendars, but because they saw it, felt it, waited for it, and when it came, the farmer saw something remarkable. The shortest shadow of the year. It did not happen suddenly. The sun's climb was slow, day by day, a little higher, a little stronger. In the weeks leading up to midsummer, the shadow at noon shrank inch by inch. It became thinner, tighter, almost reluctant to stretch. Then on that single day, the day of longest light, it pulled in as far as it would go. This was not just a curiosity. To the farmer, it was a sign, a message in light, a pivot in the year. In ancient Scandinavia, farmers marked the summer solstice not with songs or stories alone, but by observing the shadows of their doorposts. On that day, the shadow was barely a breath across the threshold. They would whisper, "The sun stands still," for that is what solstice meant, solstitium, the standing sun. In Egypt, where light ruled everything, the solstice signaled the coming of the Nile flood. Farmers watched the shadow of temple obelisks at noon. When it grew shortest, they knew the river would rise, the land would drink again, the fields would live. Across the Mediterranean, in Greece and Rome, philosophers debated the meaning of the solstice. But in the fields, the farmers simply worked. They looked at the shadow and said, "Now begins the turn," because after the longest day, time began to fall again. The light would lessen, the shadows would grow. Slowly, yes, almost imperceptibly, but certainly. And so, though the warmth continued, the farmer began to prepare. In the high Andes, where the sun ruled the mountain calendars, Quechua-speaking farmers gathered at dawn to track the first shadow of solstice morning. They placed stones to mark its edge. Not for worship, for memory. These stones were kept for decades, a history written in shadow. In Northern Europe, the day was not marked by exact science. It was known by feel. The farmer would watch how long the barn's roof took to cast shade on the chickens. On solstice, it took the longest. A quiet smile would pass between workers. The sun is high, they'd say. It cannot go higher. But this was not a celebration of triumph. It was bittersweet, because the shortest shadow carried with it a silent message. From now on, I will return. And return it did. Over the coming days and weeks, the shadow at noon would begin to lengthen again, first by a finger's width, then by a hand. Then more, the summer would ripen, yes, but the turn had begun. The farmer, though patient, was never idle. The solstice shadow told him to watch, to begin thinking of harvest. Not rushing, but preparing, for nothing lasted forever, not even the sun's rule. In Asia, particularly in Korea and China, the summer solstice was seen as a time of balance, but also of warning. Yang has reached its peak, the elders would say. Now yin will grow. The farmer nodded, not in superstition, but in rhythm. The rice was growing fast, but the days would now begin to shrink, and with them the window to act. In the American Midwest, before mechanical clocks were common, farmers would plant long stakes in the ground to watch how far the noon shadow traveled each day. On solstice, it barely moved. They'd call it the still day. A day for observation, not haste. The shadow, so often the farmer's compass, was now a barometer of change. The farmer knew not to fear this turning. It was not an end, only a cycle. And in that cycle, there was comfort, predictability, quiet assurance. The longest day came, the shortest shadow followed. Then slowly the wheel turned again. In Japan, the solstice was associated with rest. Farmers would offer thanks to the sun, not through ritual, but through pause. The shortest shadow meant the peak had been reached. Now, gently they would descend again. And so from country to country, language to language, the solstice shadow became a shared observation, a global whisper, a nod between farmers separated by oceans, joined by sky. They did not speak to each other, but they all looked down and saw the same thing. A shadow, barely there, a message in light, and the quiet beginning of the sun's long return. This story is part of a series. Every day the world keeps turning. Sunrise and sunset come again and again, marking the steady rhythm of our planet's journey around the sun. But along the way, there is a moment in every day when the world seems still. The birds fall quiet, the breeze slows. Even the insects seem to pause mid-flight. It is noon. And at noon, the farmer would stop, not because a bell rang, not because a clock struck 12, because the shadows disappeared. They didn't vanish entirely. But they grew so short, so tightly tucked beneath the feet of things, that they seemed to fold into the earth. The spade, the post, the bucket each one stood with its shadow directly beneath, as if hiding. And this, the farmer knew, was the day's midpoint. Long before midday was a measured hour, it was a sensed one, felt not by numbers, but by silence and sun. In the vast open plains of Mesopotamia, farmers would glance at their oxen and notice when the animal's shadow clung closely to its belly. That was noon. Time to rest, if only for a while. The sun was at its most unforgiving, the soil too hot to touch. In Persia, travelers told of desert farmers who drove a single iron rod into the ground and marked the moment each day when its shadow was shortest. That moment became the center of the day. It had no name, no countdown, only presence. They called it Zora, the time when all things pause. In North Africa, Bedouin herders watched the way the sun cast no sideward light through the tent slats. That meant noon. Tea would be prepared, not because the hour demanded it, but because the sun had climbed directly overhead. The shadows said so. In the rice paddies of Southeast Asia, noon brought more than heat, it brought a hush. The farmer, squinting upward, saw the tools he left standing barely cast any trace. That was the time to sit beneath the banana trees. Let the sun pass over, let the sweat dry. No sundial was needed, just observation. Just the faintest sense that the shadow had curled up and vanished into its source. Even in the cool highlands of Europe, the moment was noticed. A shepherd would pause, mid-hill, and lean on his crook. The shadow was underfoot, the lambs panted, it was noon. In many cultures, noon was the only time of day that couldn't be misread. Morning shadows stretched long and westward. Evening shadows grew again, now eastbound. But only once a day did the shadow shrink, hesitate, and rest directly beneath. The ancient Chinese astronomers took this moment seriously. They called it Zhongwu, middle noon. The imperial calendar depended on it. Each solstice, they would measure the shortest noon shadow at the capital and use it to refine their understanding of the Earth's tilt. But even the humble farmer took part in that wisdom. For him, noon meant a simple truth. The day had turned. After noon, the light began to fall, slowly, quietly, but unmistakably. In the Americas, the Maya knew noon not just as a midpoint, but as a threshold. In certain temples, the sun would shine straight through a corridor only at noon on specific days. The farmers watched, planted accordingly. Time cast through stone. In remote Japanese villages, a farmer might use his own body as the dial. He would stand upright and note where his shadow lay. When it disappeared beneath him, he knew it was time for lunch or, in older times, for a quiet bow to the mountain sun. No bells, no ticking, only this, the absence of shadow, the stillness it brought. And even today, if you go far enough into the countryside away from towers, wires, and digits, you can see it, the quiet folding of time at noon. The shadow that once stretched behind you now hides at your feet. The hoe, standing in the garden, casts no mark on the wall. The field, wide and golden, lies flat and even under a sun that presses straight down, and for a moment, the farmer stops. He does not speak, he does not move, he only listens to the world as it stands briefly in balance. This, he knows, is noon, not because anyone told him, not because he checked, but because the shadows themselves have chosen to step aside, just for a little while, and in that hush the day turns. Long before the farmer had a watch, he had a stick, just a stick pressed into the earth, nothing more than a straight branch or a carved post, but from that stick came time. It was called a Gnomon, a word from ancient Greece, meaning one who knows. And with it, the farmer did not just know when to work, but how the year itself moved. The first farmers did not call it a sundial. It had no numbers, no face, no intricate carvings. It was simply a vertical rod placed in the ground, and it told time not by ticking, but by pointing. In India, thousands of years ago, farmers planted gnomons in the fields to measure the shadow each day at the same time, usually at noon. They drew lines in the dirt, marked where the shadow ended. And then they waited. The next day they did it again. A new line, a new length. In time, a pattern emerged. A curve of shadow, lengths that told of solstices and equinoxes, of turning seasons and shifting sun. The gnomon was silent, but it spoke. In Babylon, the earliest known shadow clocks were carved in stone and clay. Their gnomons cast a line that moved through the hours, touching symbols and grooves. But for the farmer, a much simpler tool sufficed. A wooden post watched each hour. The pattern of its shadow told him when to break bread, when to water the fields, when to bring in the goats. In ancient China, the gui bao, the shadow board, was used in the countryside to observe the lengthening and shortening of days. Farmers would set the board flat and raise a rod in the middle. The position of the shadow told not only time of day, but even time of year. They kept notes. Not in books, but in memory. The day the shadow reached the edge of the board meant planting time was near. In Greece and Rome, the sundial became more sophisticated, with divisions and etchings. But the rural farmer, often illiterate, cared little for elegance. A fence post, a wagon spoke, a tree stump, anything vertical could become his gnomon. And he didn't need perfect precision, just consistency. The farmer knew that the shadow in the morning pointed west, that it was long, that as it shortened and turned, midday approached. And as it lengthened again, this time eastward, the day slipped toward evening. In the hills of Ethiopia, shepherds would build small piles of rocks beside a standing stick. Each rock marked a key moment, the shadow's farthest reach at dawn, its absence at noon, its touch on a goat's tether by late day. These were not decorations. They were memory. In Slavic lands, peasants tied cords between the gnomon and stakes at various times. When the shadow touched the string, it was time for this or that chore, time woven in rope. In Mesoamerica, the Zapotecs used vertical columns in their fields, aligned with the path of the sun. These weren't temples. They were tools. When the shadow reached the edge of the furrow, it meant rain would come within days. Planting must begin. And in the far reaches of the British Isles, old stone circles bear silent witness to shadow watching. Though today they're thought of as ceremonial, farmers once used them as giant, immobile calendars. A certain shadow crossing a certain stone meant the lambs would be born soon. The farmer read shadows as one might read a book. Not for stories, but for survival. The post-est morning shadow creeping into the chicken coop meant it was time to release the hens. The shadow reaching the outer edge of the barn wall meant the butter would churn more easily in the warmth. The disappearing shadow behind the well told the farmer the sun had reached its peak. He should rest. Or pray. Or plan. He did not need to measure in hours. The shadow said now, and that was enough. Over time, some gnomons became more elaborate. Dial plates were added, lines inscribed. But in the most rural places, the original method endured. One stick. One shadow. One farmer watching. Even today, if you walk into certain villages tucked in valleys untouched by wires and screens, you might see it. A wooden post planted deliberately, not fencing anything, not marking territory, but standing for time. Beside it, faint etchings in the soil, maybe even a rock worn smooth from hands checking where the shadow touches. Time still written in sun, still read in silence, still known not through machines, but through patience. The stick has not moved, but the shadow has, and the farmer knows what it means. There were no ticking hands, no bells ringing out, no glowing digits, but still the barn told time. Its wooden slats, its long lean-to roof, its weathered face facing the sun, these were not only practical, they were instruments of shadow. For the farmer, the barn wall was more than a structure. It was a sundial, a canvas of creeping shade, and it told the story of the day in silence. In the earliest hours before the rooster even stirred, the eastern sky glowed dimly. Slowly, the sun would rise behind the trees or over the hills, and the barn's shadow would spill westward long, low and reaching across the field like a sleepy yawn. That was how the farmer knew it was time to rise. He didn't look at a clock. He looked at how far the barn's shadow had traveled. Had it reached the stone fence yet? The line of the well? Was it still short of the pig pen? The barn became his daily map of light. As the sun climbed higher, the shadow drew back, tucking itself closer to the building. The farmer marked it not with chalk, not with carvings, but with familiarity. He simply knew, when the sun reached the right pitch in the sky, the shadow would fall upon the door's threshold. That meant time to feed the animals. Later still, the shadow touched the edge of the chicken coop. That meant the hens would soon lay. And when, at last, the shadow shrank enough to vanish beneath the overhang, the farmer knew it was midday. Not because he saw the sun, but because the barn said so. In the southern countryside of Italy, farmers would hang thin ropes from the barn's edge, letting them dangle like fringe. As the sun moved across the sky, the shadows cast by the ropes would fall across the barnyard in patterns, each one pointing to a different hour. The farmer called them corde del tempo, cords of time. In Germany's Black Forest, wooden barns were constructed with wide eaves and flat facades. Farmers would paint faint vertical lines across them, not for decoration, but for keeping track. As the sun passed, the barn's own shadow would climb these marks, a slow and steady ladder of light and time. In Japan, rural storehouses called kura were used in much the same way. Their thick clay walls would catch the shifting sunlight. When the shadow of the gabled roof reached a particular stone, it was time for rice inspection. Time to stir the fermentation barrels. Time to begin the next task. The barn was not consulted. It was observed. It didn't shout the hour. It whispered it. In parts of South America, adobe structures became rustic clocks. A farmer there might say, "When the wall swallows its own shadow, we eat. No numbers, just shade and sun." In Scandinavia, where the days stretched long in summer and short in winter, farmers grew even more attuned to the barn's behavior. They tracked where the sun hit the beams, where the shadow lay at planting season, where it slept come winter. They knew that when the barn's shadow reached the middle of the path, it was time to gather hay. That when it touched the elder tree, the sheep should be brought down from the hills. And in the highlands of Scotland, crofters would tie colored threads to nails along the barn wall. As the shadows crept across the surface, the threads would be illuminated one by one. Red for morning, blue for mid-morning, yellow for noon, simple, precise, silent. This was the language of shadows, and the barn, ever still, was fluent. It didn't matter if the sky was clouded. The farmer would still glance at the wall, checking where the faint light rested. Even in overcast dimness, a change could be seen, a shift in tone, in glow, in direction. The barn had become a part of the farmer's internal clock. He didn't need to check, he felt it. A life lived in rhythm with light, a barn that told time not in words but in shadow. And when winter came and the days grew short and the sun hung low in the southern sky, the barn's wall took on a new role. Its shadow never retreated far. The farmer would note that how the midday shadow was longer than summer's morning one, how the light barely climbed the door's frame. He understood what it meant. Time passed differently then, slower, harsher, but still the barn kept its vigil. So he hung lanterns. Not because he needed to see, but because in their flicker he could pretend the barn's wall still told him the hours. It was a living dial, a friend of the sun. A keeper of rhythm, not all clocks tick, some wait in stillness, and let the shadows speak. Every day there came a moment when the shadow stopped. Not vanished, not erased, simply ... stilled, for just a breath of time. The shadow that had been shifting, crawling, stretching, recoiling, now froze in place. It huddled tight beneath the gnomon, the post, the barn, or the man himself. It shrank into a near circle, a dark puddle at the base of the world. That moment was noon. True noon, not 12 o'clock on a wristwatch, not the echo of a bell tower or the chime of a distant clock. This was solar noon. The sun, at its highest point in the sky, perched directly above the earth, casting the shortest shadow it ever would that day. The farmer waited for it. In ancient Mesopotamia, priests tracked noon with ziggurats, marking when the sun stood at its zenith. But in the fields below, farmers knew noon by their shadows, or rather, by their southern lack. Their shadows, long and wide in the morning, began to retreat. With each passing hour they shortened, like ropes coiling inward. And then suddenly they were barely there. That was the moment of rest. In Egypt, farmers placed stone pillars in the field and watched the shadow. When it curled in close-hugging the base tightly, they knew the sun had reached its peak. The heat was strongest now. The Nile's glint brightest. It was time to pause, to shade one's eyes. To drink water, the land whispered, "It is midday." In Greece, the philosopher Anaximander wrote about the gnomon's shadow and its shortening at noon. But farmers already knew. They had felt it long before scholars named it. The moment of stillness in the field, the silence between chores. In medieval Europe, monks used canonical hours to regulate the day. But the farmer in the village? He used the shadow. Noon was when it stopped moving just for a moment, long enough to say a prayer, or chew a crust of bread, or stretch his back beside the well. In India, farmers timed irrigation by shadow. When the midday shadow fell beneath the spout of the aqueduct and touched the base of the water vessel directly, it was known that the sun had peaked. Watering would cease until the shadow lengthened again, preserving what little water they had. Among the Berbers of North Africa, herders in the desert used their own badas as gnomons. Standing tall in the sand, they'd watch their shadow shorten until it clustered around their feet. They knew then it was noon. The camels would be led to shade. The Mayans carved vertical shafts into stone observatories to mark when the sun stood directly overhead. But the peasant farmer didn't need such tools. He simply looked down. If he could not find his shadow clearly, he knew it was midday. Noon was not about measurement, it was about balance, a tipping point in the day. Before noon, the world was full of anticipation tasks beginning, tools lifted, seeds planted. After noon, the world leaned into completion chores finished, animals fed, gates closed. Noon was the hinge, the moment in between, when time neither rushed forward nor fell behind. In some places, farmers celebrated it. Noon was the hour of the midday meal, simple, quiet, eaten in the shade of a tree. Bread, a bit of cheese, maybe some dried fruit. A hand wiped across a brow, dust brushed from the shirt. Silence broken only by a distant bird or the rustle of leaves. In Japan, tea fields were tended carefully around the hour of noon, not during, but before and after. Noon itself was a moment to observe. The shortest shadow meant the least distortion ideal for judging the growth of the leaves. In Eastern Europe, superstitions grew around noon. Some believed that at noon the world paused so completely that spirits could slip through. Others said one must never sleep at noon, for dreams taken in that hour might come true. The farmer often ignored such tales, but he always noticed the shadow or lack thereof. In Andean highlands, farmers would stack stones at the edge of fields to mark where noon-esque shadow fell during the solstice. These were not monuments. They were reminders, touchstones of time, the place where the sun once stood still. Even today, when shadows move unheeded, when clocks pulse in digits and dials, the noon shadow remains. If you go outside when the sun is high and bright and stand still, you'll see it, or rather you'll barely see it. Your own shadow, that quiet companion of every hour, will have drawn in close. It will not stretch, it will not lean. It will simply crouch beneath you, still as stone. That is time holding its breath. That is the sun, pausing in its arc. That is the middle of the day, the brief, bright balance between what has been done and what is yet to come. The farmer knew it. He did not need to mark it. He only needed to see his shadow curl close and feel the stillness that came with it. The sun, once fierce and overhead, begins its quiet descent. No bells ring, no horns sound. But the farmer knows the day is exhaling and the shadows begin to stretch again. They are not the crisp shadows of morning, but soft ones. Blurred at the edges, slower to move. They lengthen across the furrows, spill across fences, reach like fingers across the pasture. Evening shadows tell a different kind of time. Not the time of beginnings, but of endings. In the Baltic lowlands, old farmers would mark the hour not by the sun's height, but by where their own shadow fell across the plowed rows. When it reached the third furrow, it was time to bring in the oxen. When it stretched to the boundary stone, it was time to close the gate. The shadow moved with finality, one slow stride at a time. In China's rural provinces, farmers used stone markers known as yin-shi shadow stones, placed precisely to catch the sun's fading angle. When the shadow touched the final mark, there would be no more hoeing, no more planting. That moment belonged to stillness. Even the animals responded. Horses turned toward their stalls. Chickens wandered back to their co-op. Dogs curled beneath carts, all without a clock, because all life watched the same lengthening shade. In the American Midwest, homesteaders built narrow towers, wooden or stone, beside their barns. These weren't lookouts. They were practical sundials. When the tower's shadow crossed the well, it was supper time. When it touched the woodshed, the children came in from play. Evening was the farmer's reckoning. He looked across his land, the lines he had carved into the earth, the seeds he had cast, the tools he had worn, the sweat drying on his back. And in the shadow that stretched before him, he measured it all. How much was done, how much remained, how quickly the light slipped away. In Arabia's deserts, Bedouin herders would squat low to the ground and watch the length of the camel's shadow. When it began to double the height of the animal, it was time to stop. Tents were pitched, fires lit, the desert cooled quickly, and the shadow told them before the cold even touched the skin. In the vineyards of southern France, a farmer would place a jug on the corner post, its handle pointing east. As the sun began to lower, the jug's shadow lengthened westward. When it met the vine rose end, it meant stop picking. The sugar in the grapes would not rise any further that day. The light was dying. And in its fading, it told stories no clock could. Old English sayings whispered through the hedgerows. When your shadow's longer than your reach, the day is done. Simple. True, in Scotland's glens, crofters marked the hills where the sun disappeared. They gave those places names: Last Light Ridge, Evening Hollow, not for poetry, for timing. When the sun dipped behind the named hill, its shadow would sweep down the valley. That was the hour to bring in the goats. Even in ancient Rome, where water clocks and sundials proliferated, farmers in the Sabine hills watched only the slope of the shadow along their stone terraces. The city might run by bronze dials, but the field ran on shadow. And in Japan, farmers called this moment you got a evening shape. It wasn't a fixed hour. It was the moment when shapes on the ground lengthened, wavered, and lost their edges. The moment when the farmer's own shadow became a companion walking beside him, quiet and patient. It was, perhaps, the gentlest time of day. Not busy, not hurried, just long and soft. Some farmers spoke to their shadows in that light. Old men, walking home with their cane, might mutter thanks to it for staying beside them, for marking another day survived. And as the sun slipped lower still, the shadows grew vast. The barn cast a shadow that touched the orchard. The tree's shadow reached the henhouse. The farmer, once towering, now stood a giant in his own field. His shape splayed across the ground like a sleeping titan. It was a final gesture from the sun, to stretch the farmer into legend before night fell. In some places, children were told not to step on the evening shadow of a man. It was bad luck, they said, to tread upon the length of someone's soul. Whether true or not, the shadow remained sacred. And then, finally, the light went gold. Then amber. Then blue, and the shadows melted into the earth, slow and sure, like they had never been. But the farmer remembered where they had been. He remembered how they moved, how they marked the time, how they stretched like sighs across his life. He didn't need a watch to tell him the day was over. The earth had spoken it, in shadows, in silence, and in grace. When the sun was gone and the sky turned to slate, another kind of light crept across the land. The moon, but the moon did not tell time the same way. Its shadows were different. They were uncertain, they were pale, and sometimes they weren't there at all. The farmer knew this. He knew that night shadows whispered rather than spoke, that their language was one of hints and illusions. Shadows by moonlight did not point clearly, they trembled, they vanished in cloud, they slipped beneath the wind. But even so, he watched them. He had no choice. In ancient times, farmers rose at night beneath a full moon to complete harvests. They called it the harvest moon, and its soft light stretched working hours into the evening. The moon's shadow, faint as it was, still outlined the rows, still told the body where to move. In Babylon, scribes recorded the cycles of the moon, not just for omens, but for agriculture. Fields needed rest, like men. And the moon helped measure that rest not in shadows exactly, but in glow, in shape, in presence, full, gibbous, half-crescent, new. The moon's shape told farmers when to plant and when to wait, when to prune trees, when to shear sheep. The moon's cycle became a shadow in time. In Japan, rice farmers aligned their planting calendar with lunar phases. The night before planting was spent watching the moon rise, watching how its light struck the mountains, the barns, the faces of their neighbors. If a man's face shone clearly in the moonlight, it was said the season would be good. But if his shadow showed no edge, the weather would be poor. In the Andes, quinoa farmers built moon altars not to worship the moon, but to observe its rhythm. When the moonlight cast shadows that pointed east, the winds would shift and planting would begin. But not all shadows were welcome. In northern Europe, long ago, they believed that walking beneath the moon could stretch your shadow too far, that you might lose part of yourself in the dark. Some carried charms in their pockets: iron, salt, wool, not against monsters, but against misreading the moon, because in the night the shadow could mislead. The farmer, returning late from a distant field, might pause by a fence post and think he saw a man, a thief, a spirit, but it was only his own shadow, cast long and trembling by the moon through drifting fog. In the American South, enslaved people navigating plantations under moonlight watched shadows closely. Too closely, a moving shadow might be a patrol, a dog, a torch. Shadows at night could mean safety or danger. They read them like signs, like warnings on the wind. But moonlight had its gentler uses too. In India, sugarcane workers harvested through the coolness of night during full moons. Moon shadows stretched across the stalks like nets. The rhythm of cutting matched the rhythm of the moon's rise. In places where rain fell too fiercely by day, night harvests began with a prayer to the moon and to the shadows it threw. Still, no one mistook the moon's shadow for the sun's, where the sun carved time in firm, clean lines, the moon painted in watercolor. Shadows wavered, changed shape, grew and shrank with the softness of clouds. Even the farmer's own shadow, so steady by day, became unfamiliar at night. It trailed him loosely, sometimes ahead, sometimes behind, sometimes gone entirely. And then, some nights, the moon did not shine at all. New moon, no shadow. The darkness then was whole. The farmer stepped carefully. He could not see the rows. He could not read the angles of his body on the earth. The time became feeling. A guess, he might pause and listen to the wind in the wheat. He might smell the change in the air and know morning is near. But the shadow gave him nothing. It had curled inward, disappeared into the soil. In such moments, the absence of a shadow was its own kind of clock, a time for stillness, a time for rest. In Arctic summers, when the moon barely rose, or in equatorial zones where it rose quickly and passed high overhead, the farmer relied more on the stars. But the moon, even in its silence, had taught him patience. Shadows might vanish, but they always returned. The earth turned, the sky wheeled. The shadow came back, and so the farmer waited, not with worry, but with knowing. He had seen the moon wax and wane 1,000 times. He had watched his own shape stretch across frostbitten grass and moonlit snow. And he knew that in the stillness of night the body keeps time, even when the eye cannot. A leaf fluttered in moonlight, a cow shifted in its sleep, a tree creaked, and somewhere, faint on the ground, a shadow moved again. Time passes, seasons shift, but the shadow remembers. Even when the farmer forgets, the land holds the lines where shadows once fell, like creases in a palm, like folds in worn cloth. In fields now overgrown, if the sun strikes just right, an old post might cast a familiar line just where the oxen once turned, just where the farmer once stood. The shadow lands there still, even though the man is long gone. In ancient Greece, philosophers debated the measure of time, but peasants, who worked the earth with bare hands, trusted simpler truths. They knew that where the shadow touched the olive tree in summer, it would touch again. The land had memory, the sun a rhythm. They didn't call it science, they called it habit. And habit held time together like stitching. In Africa's Sahel, long before modern calendars, elders trained boys to watch the shadows of termite mounds. Tall and rough-edged, they cast marks upon the dust that shifted ever so slightly as days passed. At the right time of year, the shadow would stretch toward the well, then away again. That motion meant the rains were coming. It had always meant the rains were coming. The shadow knew before the clouds gathered. In the rice terraces of Vietnam, farmers carved notches into walking sticks. Not to lean on, but to hold upright in the field? Each notch was a date, not by number, but by memory. When the sun's shadow struck the fourth notch at midday, it meant the floodgates should open. The pattern was taught father to son, shadow to shadow. In Ireland, old women would point to where the sun rose through the trees and say, "That's where my father knew the cows were late," a patch of light through leaves. A shifting silhouette on a barn wall. Memory lived in those shadows, long after the people who watched them were gone. Even tools remembered. A hoe left resting against the wall would catch the morning light differently each season. A farmer might look up from tying his boots and see that the shadow on the handle had shifted, no clock ticked. No alarm rang, but something told him, today is not like yesterday. And so he watched. In the Middle East, shepherds marked time with shadow stones, small rocks placed atop larger ones, arranged in patterns that mimicked the sun's arc. Over years, these arrangements grew into cairns, silent and sacred. No names carved, no dates, just shapes and angles. A calendar not of paper, but of posture. In the Andes, some farmers built walls with holes drilled through them. When the sun hit the hole just right, it cast a beam across the yard. But more importantly, it cast a shadow through that beam onto the wall behind. When the shadow reached the seventh brick, the festival began. A shadow's memory could span generations. In Eastern Europe, peasants told of a man who had watched the shadow of his haystack fall across a single daisy every spring. He never touched the flower, never mowed it down. He said it bloomed when the day was right for sowing. Nothing else. And so, each year, when the haystack's shape once again stretched across the hill, and that small white blossom rose in its midst, the man went to his field and began to plow. Because the shadow knew. In Mesopotamia, tablets were carved with diagrams of sun and line. Archaeologists once thought they were astronomy, but others now believe they were reminders. Markers of when the canal's edge would fall into shade, telling the farmer it was time to shut the gate and let the water pool. Even now, in satellite images of ancient ruins, long lines stretch across the earth straight and unwavering. Some say they are roads, but others wonder, were they lines where the shadow once passed? Lines where time was kept not by writing, but by watching? And what of the barns? In North America, many old barns are built with windows or doors in odd places high on the loft or offset from center. When asked why, the answer is often the same. That's where the light comes in. Or, that's where the shadow tells us noon has come. They don't say it like history. They say it like instinct, because the farmer doesn't always record time. He feels it, and the shadow helps him feel it. A chill on the skin when the line crosses the hearthstone. A warmth on the cheek when the beam lands on the porch post. A hush in the trees when the barn wall falls under shadow and the birds fall quiet. And sometimes, it's not even seen, it's heard. A crow calls from the east at the same time the well goes dark. A wind moves when the shadow reaches the base of the hill. The farmer closes his eyes. He doesn't need to look, he knows. The shadow is not just a thing of the sun, it's a thing of memory. A thing of repetition. A thing of rhythm so deep it settles into the bones. And though watches break and calendars burn and clocks forget, the shadow remembers. The farmer did not always need a stick or a stone or a line drawn in dust. Sometimes he only needed himself. For even the body casts a shadow, and that shadow too could tell time. Before instruments, before dials, before sundials etched in bronze or carved in wood, the very first clock was the human form, upright, grounded, turning slowly with the day. In the earliest farms long before temples or towns a man would rise, stand in the same place, and note where his own shadow fell. As seasons passed, he noticed the changes. One day, it pointed to the edge of the garden. Another, it fell across the path. Another, it didn't appear at all, lost in the thick gray of winter cloud. The body knew the shape of morning. It knew the curve of afternoon. It knew the long stretch of evening. In Egypt, scribes noted the time not by device, but by where the priest's shadow fell during his chant. If it reached the first stone, the sun offering was complete. If it reached the second, he had lingered too long. Time was a posture. In India, before sundials were carved into temple floors, farmers used the length of their own shadow to measure the workday. If the shadow of the head reached the feet, it was mid-morning. If the shadow stretched a body and a half, it was time to rest. If it disappeared completely beneath the toes, the sun was directly overhead and no labor should be done. In China, scholars recorded the human Gnomon. A man standing upright could serve as a sundial. A student might be taught, "At midday your head eats your feet," a poetic way of saying no shadow. Or the shortest one of all, but it wasn't just standing. Kneeling in a field, the farmer might notice how his arm cast a shadow across the furrow. The depth of that shadow changed with the hour, thin and sharp in morning, blurred and long in evening. The angle of the wrist, the line of the elbow, the curve of the back, these were markers, silent, precise. The body, repeated daily in work, became the instrument. In parts of Central Asia, herders sat cross-legged during breaks. letting the shadow of their knees fall upon the grass. The distance between the knee's edge and its shadow was used to guess when to return the flock. Some claimed they could tell within 10 minutes, not with magic, with memory. In medieval Europe, laborers carried no clocks, but they carried the habit of watching. A hand raised to shade the eyes would cast a shadow on the shoulder. At a certain tilt, it meant the bell would soon ring for vespers. They didn't look to the sky, they looked at themselves. In South America, Incan astronomers taught farmers to track the shadow of their own heads during planting festivals. As children, they were told, "When your shadow points to your brother, it is time to begin." That brother might be real or imagined, a metaphor for community, for unity with the land. Even in modern times, echoes remain. A farmer might lean on a shovel and notice how the shadow of his hat crosses the barn threshold. That line means lunch. Not because a clock said so, but because it always has. The body became a habit, a sundial carried with you. In Papua New Guinea, tribes use full-body shadow casting to mark ceremonies. A man would lie down, arms spread, and his shadow drawn in the sand. Later, they'd return to see how that outline had shifted, how time had moved. The sun made it clear, no moment was fixed. Even the shape of a man changed in time. Some carried staffs marked not for walking, but for alignment. They would stand the staff upright beside them and compare the shadow, length, staff, and self. When the two matched, it was the hour of gathering. When clocks came, they were distrusted. They made no shadow. They offered no warmth. They ticked, but they did not grow. The farmer still looked to his hand, his boot, the fall of his arm on the grass. That shadow was real. It lived. It shifted with him like breath. In dry fields beneath a punishing sun, when all else was silent, the shadow might be the only thing to speak. And it whispered, "You are here, you are now, you are moving through the day." In some ways, the shadow was a companion, a double, an echo made visible. The ancients said that a man's shadow was part of his soul, that to lose it was to lose time itself. In shadowless fog or moonless night, one might feel adrift, not because of darkness, but because of disconnection. The body without its shadow is untethered, unmarked, unmeasured. But when the shadow returns stretching long behind at sunrise or falling gently ahead at dusk, it is a reminder you are part of the turning world. And the time it keeps ... is written on your back. Shadows, they said, never lied, but sometimes they did. Not with malice, not with deceit, but with confusion, with silence, with misdirection. For even the oldest farmer, who knew the land like his own breath, could be misled by a sky veiled in cloud, or a wind that shifted the dust, or a shadow that vanished in mist. Imagine it. The field is ready, the soil warm, the birds loud. The farmer waits for the shadow on the edge of the well, the one that always told him when to begin. But it doesn't come. The sun stays hidden behind a quilt of gray. The line never appears, and so he waits, 1 day. 2 days, 3, and the season grows impatient. In some years, the sun forgets its schedule, or rather follows a path obscured by storm. And the shadows, without light, fail to tell the story. In ancient Babylonia, scribes noted years where the shadow came late. Their calendars held markings not just of dates, but of absences. No mark on the 3rd moon. No length on the 7th day. They feared these signs, for they meant confusion. Crops planted too early or too late, floods missed, harvests spoiled. In medieval France, farmers told tales of the false shadow, a trick of low light that appeared at dawn, long before the true line should come. One peasant planted early, misled by this length. The frost killed every shoot, and though no one blamed him, they all remembered the shadow had lied. Or rather, he had trusted too soon. On the Scottish moors, where mist dances for weeks, some families learned not to rely on the sun at all. They planted by the wetness of moss, by the tilt of fern, by the hush of birdsong. Yet even then, when the clouds parted, they'd glance toward the barn post just in case. A habit, a hope. But when the post cast no line, they whispered, "Not today." In Japan, rice farmers used shadow lines cast from narrow garden walls. But during monsoon season, those shadows vanished for weeks. The old ones would gather and speak of days without time, a haunting phrase. Without shadow, without sun, they drifted unsure when to prune, when to wade, when to sing. Time unraveled in the fog. In Egypt, the annual flooding of the Nile was predicted not just by stars, but by shadows on temples. But in years of heavy sandstorm, the skies turned copper, and even midday resembled twilight. The priests emerged, robes billowing in red wind, and found no shadow on the stone. They returned inside, muttering oaths. The farmers waited. But the flood came early. Even in more recent centuries, sailors turned farmers in the New World brought with them brass sundials. They placed them carefully in gardens and vineyards. But the new land held new rules. Trees too tall, hills too steep, light too wild. The dial said one thing, the land said another. The farmers learned painfully that shadows do not always travel well, and yet, in every story of the lying shadow, the broken pattern, the missed hour, there was still faith, a kind of reverence, for shadows, unlike men, did not lie with purpose. They simply bent to the world's whim. A shadow cast wrong was not evil. It was a lesson. In Siberia, reindeer herders told stories of a year where no shadows came for months. The snow reflected too brightly, the clouds too thick. When the shadows returned in spring, the people gathered not to curse them, but to celebrate. They offered food to the returning light. They danced around the long shadows as they stretched toward the river, because when time returned, it was like a friend at the door. In some Andean villages, there were songs sung to the sun not to rise, but to clear the sky. Children chanted on rooftops, calling the shadow home. When it finally came, the village stopped all labor to mark its arrival. Even today, in remote places, some farmers note the odd days. The days when the shadow is off. They scribble in worn notebooks. Line too short, being scattered. Sky wrong. They do not panic, but they notice. For the shadow, like the weather, speaks. Not always clearly, not always kindly, but truly. Its silence is a kind of warning, its absence a kind of wound. But always it returns. After the storm, after the smoke, after the eclipse, the shadow finds its place again. And the farmer steps out into the light, plants his feet in old soil, and watches the line fall across the earth once more. Not because he trusts blindly, but because he has seen it fail and still come back. Because even when the shadow lies, it remembers how to tell the truth. And so the sun dips low once more. A field lies golden, its stalks heavy, bowed not just with grain, but with memory. The farmer stands, hands folded, eyes soft. He watches a shadow stretch from his boots across the stubble of the harvest. Long now, soft-edged, fading, it is the last shadow of the day. And perhaps the last of the season, because farming has changed. Clocks now hum inside pockets. Satellites blink from above. Weather is charted. Time is scheduled, and yet the shadow still falls. In a quiet garden behind an old house, an elderly woman waters her vegetables. She glances at the fence post, sees the shadow cross the path, and nods. Time for tea. A boy in a rural schoolyard traces his own shadow with chalk at recess, curious how it shortens each week. A monk tending a mountaintop orchard watches the shadow of a leaf tremble in the breeze and recalls an older rhythm. The shadow remains because we remain. Because no matter how far we drift into lighted screens and synthetic hours, there is still something ancient in the way light meets form. The way the sun greets stone, the way shadow slips around root and rock, the way time does not tick but leans. The farmer, long ago, did not need a bell. He needed only the line that fell across his field, and in that line he saw the story of season, of labor, of patience, of trust. The shadow was not just a tool. It was a teacher. It taught stillness. It taught watching. It taught repetition, not for boredom, but for truth. Every day the shadow changed, yet returned. And so did the farmer, not because he was told to, not because he was paid to, but because the land called him, the light guided him, and the shadow reminded him, you are part of something larger, something older, something that stretches behind you and ahead of you. In the temples of Egypt, the lines etched by priests have worn thin, but their angles still mark the sun. In the terraced hills of China, the old stones remember the curve of morning light. In English meadows, fence posts still cast long markers across clover. Even in the city, where glass and steel steal the sky, a shadow may fall between buildings, brief but honest. And someone may look and know and feel that time is still here, and it still speaks in light. We do not always need clocks. We need attention, a pause, a glance, a moment with the shadow. And so the farmer watches one last time. The sun disappears behind the ridge. The line blurs, then vanishes. The day ends. But not the rhythm. Not the story. Because tomorrow the shadow will return. And someone, somewhere, will wait for it. And in that quiet moment, time will begin again. This piece was inspired by traditional Chinese poetry. More specifically, this piece is in homage to an untitled poem by Han Shang, which was published in the Stony Thursday Broadside series. The original poem reads, "No title, the sun dips low, the light fades, the river is hushed, the boatman is gone. The lone crane flies back, the frost is heavy, the mountains are cold. What is this endless sorrow, this endless sorrow?" The repetition echoes the loneliness of the speaker, who is cut off from community, contemplating nature and existence alone. I've been thinking about this poem a lot lately and how relevant it feels in our technologically advanced world. When we speak of getting lost in social media or feeling disconnected from the natural world, I think of this poem. I hope my piece can serve as a reminder to all of us to get outside, to disconnect from our devices and to contemplate the beauty of the world around us and the rhythms of nature. Thank you for listening.